So she's going to help us think more deeply about communication, and particularly in the realm of science. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
And you're seeing my the main slide, not the notes, is that correct?
Yep, I'm seeing the main slide, yep.
Great. Well, another piece maybe to add to my bio that can help me build a little bit of trust with you all is I actually have a bachelor's in marine biology and a master's in conservation biology. And it wasn't until I got to my PhD that I was, well, it was actually for the research for my master's, but also my PhD was entirely focused on the human dimensions of managing natural resources, and specifically how we make decisions and why we make the decisions we do, either as managers or people who are using the resource. And as Lisa mentioned, I did most of my work for 15 years in Latin America and the Amazon, looking at different institutional types and choices around managing those forests. But I shouldn't say most, because I have had 10 years since then now. And in the last 10 years, my work has been focused in the Puget Sound region, where I work directly with the state and county and watershed agencies in implementing their social ecological system restoration programs. And this, I don't know, when you say we're going to dive deeper, I think we are in some ways going to dive deeper, but obviously 6 common myths is a pretty big umbrella. But what I'm going to share with you today is a brief review of things that no matter how many times we learn about them and teach them, they still happen over and over and over again. So in that sense, it maybe allows for another level of introspection on your part, because most of you are obviously, just by your job titles, experts in communication, and maybe even more so than me in some ways. But we require a 200 level class for all of our majors, fish and wildlife majors, about, I think it's about 400 students per year take it, and it's called Communication Skills for Fish and Wildlife Professionals. And some of these myths are coming from how these are just persistent things that students believe, no matter how much science I show them is to be the opposite, or even when I work with policymakers and I try to explain what the psychological and communication science says to be true. So I will go ahead and start. And I had a hard time myself choosing just 6. And so you'll see that I cheated and I have corollaries to a couple of them. So the first myth that I'm going to share a little bit about is the myth that if you provide information to people, you will change their beliefs. And that the corollary to that is what you say is what people hear. The second myth I'm going to try to bust with you is that raising awareness will improve the environment. The third is that people who make detrimental natural resource decisions are ignorant or uniquely biased. The fourth is that demonstrating your expert knowledge is the most important factor in gaining trust when you're communicating with people. And the corollary to that is that precise scientific language makes you sound more believable and smarter. The fifth is that I'm really good at talking, so communicating science must be easy. And 6, that open participation to everyone is necessary for buy-in. And so you can tell these 6 are at really different scales and even with very different audiences. So these are, when I say communication, it's with a big C. It's not necessarily just science communication, but it should cover all of the types of audiences we work with. So let's dive a little bit into myth number 1, that providing information will change people's beliefs. I have to say, one of the silver linings of our current political climate is that it's not hard for me to get people to understand what I'm saying in this one, because we're watching it around us daily. There is something called the boomerang effect, where if somebody has a certain belief system and the thing that you are going to share with them might be in slight contrast to what they believe, they are much more likely to dig in and come up with even better excuses to why their beliefs are correct. And so we have to be really careful when we are sharing information. And I actually am not doing best practices here. I'm just assuming you guys are open to this idea, because me telling you this, if you don't believe this, could actually make you dig in even more. But the idea is that we shouldn't take for granted that just because we're sharing information, people will change, even if we have the most logical and well supported information out there. Part of this, why does this happen? Part of it is whether or not the person you're communicating with even trusts you and trusts where you come from, whether or not what you're saying threatens their identity, and often our beliefs are kind of the core of our identity to different social groups. And then there's this conservation mindset, and I don't mean this as in conservation of biology, I mean this as in we want to try to not, it's a lot of energy to change our minds. And so it's a lot easier to find reasons to justify why what we believe is right than it is to find new ways of thinking about something that we've thought about for a long time. So the boomerang effect is pretty important. And I think it has some critical implications for how we communicate any kind of information, but especially science. And the corollary to that one is the idea that what you say is what people hear. So I'll often see someone say something, and even I'll say, you know, that I understood this, and they'll say, well, that's not what I said. It's like, well, the process of communication includes both encoding the information effectively for your audience and that your audience decodes it in the way that you intend to. And we both have responsibility in that process. So we also as communicators need to think through what's the likely scenario of how this person, or what are all the different ways this person could decode the information I'm sharing. And so this is just an example of someone talking about a catfish and the person decoding it as a cat fishing. But the idea that that everyone's going to think like you and be able to receive your information just how you present it is a myth. Now, a second myth, totally different myth. So these are kind of silos. They aren't really building off of each other very well. Is this myth that we hear a whole lot, that raising awareness will improve the environment. And I hope this doesn't become an existential crisis. I hope, you probably can hear my dog, sorry. But this one kind of does cause people an existential crisis, and you'll often see when we're writing papers on conservation or natural resource management that people say, well, the number one thing we need to do is educate people on these things. Well, the reality is that not everyone has the same values as you do, and so just having more information isn't necessarily going to change how they interact with the environment or change the policies that they support. But the part that I want to share here, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the diffusion of innovations. This is a theory of innovation adoption throughout society, and this works for anything. It works for explaining how COVID masks have been adopted and used. It works for explaining how an idea grows through society. And what it says is that the first 2.5% of society will kind of innovate the idea or innovate the mask or the science behind the mask that shows that using a mask is effective at reducing the contagion. And then you have a portion of society for that very thing. And so this model is very individual for each innovation. So for that very innovation, you'll have early adopters, then you'll have an early majority, a late majority, and then you'll always have laggards. So no matter what idea we're sharing, whether it is a scientific piece or a technology, we're always going to have this distribution throughout society of how people adopt that idea. And so then when we think on top of that, well, okay, so what would we do to maybe encourage or motivate people in these different categories for that concept to adopt that idea? The only ones where outreach and education and communication really work are in the innovators and early adopters. These are people that tend to already have values that are in alignment and personal desires and maybe even the social capital and networks in alignment with the idea, and they'll adopt it. Once we get to the early and late majority, it's less about communication and more about social marketing. And social marketing is about reminding people to do things they want to do, putting out prompts, which are reminders, creating, like asking Brad Pitt to demonstrate the use of it, creating these models that people would want to copy, just making things really easy for people. So removing the barriers, the external barriers that would keep people from doing things that they might agree with, but it's not a huge priority. And then lastly, the other thing about this is that there will always be people who will not respond to either communications or marketing processes, and they would require regulations to adopt an idea. So it's just something, I find this to be a really helpful model when we're thinking about communication. I find a lot of people expect that when they communicate, they're going to get 100% of the audience on board, and they're not, right? You're going to get the people who already, like the very first slide, who already have belief systems that are somewhat in line, and what you're saying is fairly easily added to their existing belief system. Myth 3. People who make detrimental natural resource decisions are ignorant or uniquely biased. I hear this a lot, a whole lot, and it's probably one of my biggest frustrations, is that we assume that people who don't act in the way that we think is the right way to act based on how the knowledge we have and how we interpret that knowledge must be bad or ignorant or biased. And this is just one of dozens of models that we have in behavior change theory that demonstrates that actually you have no information is nowhere in here. So this is a model of behaviors. I'm trying to see, oh yeah, I do. So you can see, so four potential behaviors that people could engage in: environmental activism, environmental citizenship, supporting policy, or doing private sphere behaviors. Those would be things like recycling or turning off your water. And the things that are precedent to that they're all about senses of obligations, whether they even think they have the chance to reduce that threat, whether or not they sense that things that they care about will have adverse consequences if they don't do it, and then all the way to worldview and values. But nowhere in here is knowledge or ignorance, nor is there the bias. So one thing to remember is that there are a whole lot of antecedents to the psychology of why people do things, and it's not just because of lack of information. Myth number 4 is that demonstrating your expert knowledge is the most important factor for gaining trust. This is actually not at all true. Most people, if you think about who you trust in your life and think about why you trust them, you don't necessarily trust the ones who have told you over and over again that they're an expert in something, especially if they're an expert in something that you also think that you know quite a bit about. Gaining trust has a lot of other social factors in it, and I'm going to move into those actually with the corollary to this and with myth number 5. So one of them is, the corollary here is that precise scientific language makes you sound more believable or smarter. And I think probably a whole lot of you know this one already because you all are communicators, but the more we use words that only certain groups understand or use, the more we are not only losing our audience, but we are actually identifying ourselves as an outgroup to who they are. And that will make people listen to us less. So you don't want to be using scientific jargon to people because they might say, well, that just sounds scientific jargon, and I'm not a scientist. And if it's somebody who doesn't want to be, for example, a scientist. So you can really alienate people by using things that are jargon. And it's really hard to figure out what jargon is, to be honest, because we're so caught up in it ourselves. And this is where practicing communication with different kinds of audiences helps identify jargon. Number 5 is I'm good at talking, so communicating science is easy. So this is the other part about building trust. It turns out that the majority of communication is about listening. And that includes when you're standing in front of a crowd, or even when you're creating a website, or even right here. I can't see any of you right now. My screen is set up so it's just the presentation. So obviously I can't do much listening. I can't even read your faces. But ideally, you should be paying attention to whatever cues your audience is given, and even listening comes beforehand, right? Asking about what your audience is, what your audience understands before you even start talking with them. That listening builds trust because people love to be listened to, but it also helps you frame your message much better to be able to fit within their existing understanding and their existing belief system. So your ability to talk is not necessarily helpful. In fact, I really don't like talking myself much either. And then the last one that I'm going to do is that open participation to everyone is necessary for buy-in of an idea. And this is more one that comes across my mind and that I bring up because of my work with state and federal agencies who are required to have public participation. And often you'll see that people will have public participation, open participation events. And the idea being that the more we open this up so that everybody feels like they're allowed to participate, then the more likely they are to adopt and accept our ideas. Well, one of the key parts about adopting information is that you feel an identity with the people who are communicating to you. And social identity theory actually very specifically defines that your in-group, to have an in-group, you actually have to have an out-group. So by definition, for an in-group to exist, there must be people who don't belong to that group. And being in an in-group, feeling like you belong to something, like this group right here, feeling like you belong to this group, this 35 plus group, you're more likely to take in and absorb information than from somebody who is from it, than even someone from me, except that I was invited by someone from the in-group that would communicate to you. And this is just my new fascination lately is with neuroscience and the way neuroscience is understanding the role of communication in our brains and how it's affecting memory making and learning, basically. And so this is a neuro image, and what it's doing is it's looking at blood flow in places when people receive the same exact information from somebody in their in-group compared to somebody in their out-group. And so you'll see, and it's going to the mid parts of the brain, which is where learning takes place. So you'll see that information shared by people who are part of an in-group is activating their brains to create learning and to create memories, whereas that same information that's shared by someone from the out-group is not actually creating any brain activity. So I translate this, and it's not a hypothesis that I've tested, except that I've seen it play out a whole lot, in that having completely open fora does not necessarily improve learning and information sharing. So those are the 6 myths, and I'm going to just go back to the very first slide, and I'm going to pull out of my presentation mode and open it up if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you so very, very much. At this point, if you see this chat function, I'll go ahead and open it up for folks for questions, and I'll just move through those and call on you. And I know we're a little bit behind on time because we had so many introductions, which was awesome, but that's why I put in all the breaks. So don't worry, we'll go ahead and do our question times. So I'll just open it up to everyone, just chat in your box, and then I'll turn it over to you at that point.
I'll go ahead and go. I put it in the chat, and I'm sorry if you can hear the chainsaw because my husband decided now would be a really good time to take the tree down in the backyard. But would that be possible for us to get this, not just the slides, but I would love that recording of you explaining it, because I think that would be excellent for so many people to hear, students and even staff, when they're giving information to students and then they don't take it the same way that they think they're giving it. I think it would be really great for lots of people. I appreciated it. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe that you recorded it, and you're welcome to share that how you would like. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. And other questions? I saw.
While we're waiting for questions, I can give an anecdote in that I was the first to present at a panel on communications, and Lisa can back up on this. It was fascinating to watch how the following up presenters, who were people who were further along in their career, didn't have training in communications, and basically said in their presentations the exact opposite of what I said. And how unable they were to absorb this. Everything I presented to you today is based on scientific experiments, right? And the information that was shared, the rest of the information was pretty anecdotal for the rest of the conference. And it was just, one of the students who was in the room said, it was a fantastic demonstration of exactly everything you said. And I said, I'm really glad to hear that you were able to observe it that way, and take it as a learning tool the reason I'm presenting these as myths is because they're so dominant in the way we think about this.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you so much for that. Christy, we have time. We have Christina Simon. So Christina, do you want to share yours and Andy's? We'll come after that.
I was just wondering, I regularly communicate with students things that I think are kind of critical scientific messages. And some of the students I think view themselves as kind of an outgroup to me, like we differ ideologically. What advice do you have to make a message heard?
Well, from what I always say is figure out how to become part of their in-group in some way. How can you make, we're connected to everybody in some way, right? And so in what way can you connect to them? But at least to gain their trust. And then when you're sharing the information, figure out how to share it in a way that matters to them. So you might have to gather a lot of information from them first about what they already believe and what they already know. And then you can say, well, have you thought about how this fits into that idea or something to that effect? So first is gaining the trust to get them to speak to you, but then that's where that listening comes in. Listen, and then find your opportunity, like your window for where your information could find a place to be.
Awesome. Thanks. We're going to end with Andy. Do you want to try your question?
Yeah, and I really think it's similar to the first question now that I heard the answer. If facts don't work, what do you do? I was thinking about students when I asked it, but it's also right now my in-laws. You know, as my wife talks to her in-laws about the current situation, facts aren't working. What do we do? And we're in there in group, sort of.
Yeah, and again, I would say it's all about building those relationships, and part of building those relationships is listening first and looking for the opportunities there.
Awesome. And we have Annie sharing amazing follow-up for the Invisible podcast episode titled 2 Heartbeats a Minute. So I'll just point that out to everyone. And I did see that there were several of you that said, wow, as Lisa said, can we please have a copy? And that is exactly was my response was, this is such a wonderful, I really appreciate you being here and sharing with us. Thank you so much. And I know we'll also have other questions that will be coming up. So is there a way for folks to reach out to you later if that's possible? Can I share I've shared your email. Is that something they can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm easy to find. They don't hide us at the university.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you. Thank you so very much. And I see others are saying thank you. And I know we can, if you're well, we'd love to have you join our breakout sessions at this point if you'd like to. If not, I understand it's Friday night and you have a lot on your plate, and I promised I wouldn't keep you long, so I appreciate that.